Hi, this is Rebecca Donald. I'm the Library Director at Trinity International University, and this session is on how to be academically honest in your program and how to avoid plagiarism particularly. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Here we go. Okay, so first of all, I just wanted to mention that Trinity takes plagiarism very seriously, as most other universities do. And the handbook talks about the consequences for plagiarism. Usually on the first time, you might fail the project and have to redo it. Later consequences, though, if it's repeated, you could be expelled from the program. There have been PhD students sometimes who have completed their dissertation and then later it was found that they plagiarized on their dissertation, so then they had their degree taken away. And it is possible to accidentally plagiarize, as we'll be seeing in this session. So we want you to learn what plagiarism is and how to avoid it so you don't accidentally end up doing it. Okay, so first let's talk about the importance of citation, or why academia takes it so seriously. First of all, the creation of writing, of thoughts, of ideas, and words is a big part of the work of academics. So by citing it, you're acknowledging the hard work that they've done, that they've come up with these original ideas, that they've written about it in a good way, that it's being used by you and by others. So that's also point number 2, the academia values that creation of new knowledge and original thoughts. And it also helps to differentiate between what are your new ideas and thoughts that you're adding to this conversation, to this academic conversation, and that you're dialoguing with these other partners who have their things to say, and then you're responding to them, either building on it, sometimes disagreeing, having new ideas and thoughts related to it. Related to that, it shows that you have done your research, that you're not just making things up or standing on your own, but that you have this weight of research behind you that helps inform your thoughts and your ideas. It also helps the reader by giving them a background to the research behind your work. And if they want to go back and research it more and develop it more themselves, then they can follow your citations and learn more about the topic that way, which is one reason why having consistent formatting in your citations is considered important. That I've seen some citations where it's really hard to figure out what the information is about the source. So you want it to be clear for the reader so they can follow it easily. Okay, so there are 3 main ways that students are accused of plagiarism. And if you'll notice, I tried to have citations in here for all of where I found these ideas so that I'm academically honest myself. So the first way that, and this is the most common way that people are accused of plagiarism, is if you have a quotation, like exact words, or if you rewrite an idea in your own words, like a paraphrase or a summary, if you don't cite those, that's considered plagiarism. So oftentimes we think about it just being the exact words of the author, which that is one of the most common forms of plagiarism, but it also is about the ideas. So if you take an idea from an author, you also need to cite them, even if it's in your own words. The second is related to that. If you do use their exact words, you have to put quotation marks around those words. Even if you have the citation, the quotation marks are indicating that you got those words from another author. Otherwise, it's implying that maybe you got the idea from them, but you rewrote it in your own way, of writing. And usually it's kind of clear to the reader, like the teacher, when they're going along and they're reading, and all of a sudden the paper doesn't sound like your way of writing anymore, and it sounds like someone else. That's a sign that there might be some plagiarism there. The third one is the most challenging. This is something that I still struggle with a lot myself. And this is if you do decide to put it in your own words, make sure that you write it enough that it sounds like you and not just a tweaking of someone else's words. So sometimes I've seen students who'll take a sentence from another author, and then they'll just change a few words in there, like maybe use a thesaurus, like Google words, and try and find another word that means the same thing. So they aren't really writing it how they would naturally write it. They're just tweaking the other person's words. One suggestion that I found helpful for how to do this is to look at the work and try and really internalize the ideas for yourself so that you understand it well, and then put it away for a little bit and then come back and just try writing it how you would naturally say those ideas without looking at the original. And then you want to check the original to make sure you weren't too close, but that is a way to make sure that you're saying it how you naturally would rather than just using their words, because it can be hard sometimes when you're looking at what they said to think of a better way to say it or a different way to say it. And if you're really struggling, go ahead and use quotation marks and use the exact phrase. That can be better than accidentally plagiarizing. However, you also don't want your whole paper to be quotes. You do want to include some of your own words and your own thoughts. And oftentimes the paper can flow better if you're kind of incorporating these ideas from the authors into your own argument, into your own flow of the paper. So I usually try and use quotations somewhat selectively for things that are particularly well said by the author, and then try and put a lot of the other stuff into the flow of my paper. All right, let's look at some examples. So this is a quote from a book by D.A. Carson, our own D.A. Carson. So this is the original quote. He said, "However hard some things are to understand, it is never helpful to start picking and choosing biblical truths we find congenial, as if the Bible is an open-shelved supermarket where we are at perfect liberty to choose only the chocolate bars." So this would be a correct citation. It has quotation marks around the exact words. And then this is the Turabian, the TIU style Turabian, that's a parenthetical citation that the EDS and ICS programs use. Those of you who use footnotes would just have the little number footnote and then a footnote down at the bottom, which would be the same idea. All right, let's look at number 1 and see if that one's okay, or if that's plagiarism. This is another way that a parenthetical citation could happen. You could include the author and the year in the sentence. So this one says, Carson states that picking and choosing biblical truths we find congenial is never helpful. So this one is pretty good. It has quotation marks around this very distinctive phrase, which if that wasn't there, it would be considered plagiarism, and it has a citation. Someone in the last session pointed out that never helpful is also duplicated up here. So you might want to put quotation marks around that as well to be safe, or to try and write it differently. All right, number 2. So according to Carson, Christians should not decide which biblical ideas they like and which should be discarded. So I think this one is okay. So this one has the citation again, and it has the citation to that idea, but I don't think I really duplicate too many of the exact words, if any. And this is just written like how I might naturally write it. All right, number 3, Carson says that choosing truths we prefer is similar to browsing an open-shelved supermarket to locate the chocolate bars. So this again has a citation, but it uses some very distinctive phrases like open-shelved supermarket. D.A. Carson is British, and so he uses the phrase open-shelved supermarket, which I would never, as an American, I would never use. I would say grocery store. So that already sounds like it's not me if I didn't use quotation marks around it. So if you have a phrase like that that's very distinctive, that's original to the author, you definitely want to put quotation marks around that. And I have seen cases where Trinity professors have caught plagiarism in students with just a couple of words or a few words here and there. And they've been sent to us to talk about that. And so a lot of students are surprised that they hadn't thought it could just be a couple words that might be considered plagiarism. So again, it's good to be careful. If it is like a really common word like Bible or something, or truth, you don't need to put quotation marks around that because that's something anyone could use. But definitely pay attention to if you're using very similar words. All right, number 4. This says it is not advisable to begin selecting the ideas from the Bible that seem agreeable, as if the Bible is a grocery store where we have the freedom to select merely the delicious candy. So this one has a couple of problems. The first is that it doesn't have the citation. So this idea came from Carson, but we're not saying that it did. We're implying that we came up with this analogy. So it needs the citation. And then this also has the issue of it is pretty much the same sentence, but just with a lot of the words changed. So if you took like this phrase, so helpful was changed to advisable, picking and choosing was changed to selecting, biblical truths was changed to ideas from the Bible, congenial was changed to agreeable, open shelf supermarket to grocery store, liberty to freedom. So there's a lot of words that were changed, but this is an example of just tweaking it where I didn't write how I naturally do it. I just tweaked that sentence. So sometimes even if the sentence structure is the same, that could be considered plagiarism because again, you're just tweaking them and not really writing your own natural sentence. So some other ideas to talk about related to that. So if you imitate the sentence structure or the paragraph, that could be considered plagiarism. So again, if you just took a paragraph and then are tweaking the words in that. So if someone read it and read the original and it's had a very similar rhythm and sound with just some tweaks, that could be considered plagiarism. Also, one of our professors talks about not borrowing the overall structure of the paper or their argument or points. For example, he had a student who took an article and then he pretty much followed the exact structure of that article. So the main argument of the article was his main thesis statement. The sections or points that the article had were his main points. And I don't think he even cited where it came from. Or if he did, it wasn't clear that that whole structure was coming from it. So again, the professor is wanting you to have your own original argument and ideas. You might lean heavily on that author and use a lot of their ideas, which you'd want to make clear in the paper, but you don't want to just completely copy their argument and ideas. Okay. Another form of academic dishonesty, paradoxically, could be if you do use quotation marks, but you change the words of the original, because then you're implying that the author said something that isn't exactly what they said, especially if it changes the idea of the original, but even just a few words difference is not exact. So I always try and make sure that I look back at the original to make sure I didn't leave out a few words here or there, because sometimes when I'm taking notes, I tend to shorten things a little bit. If you do, you might need to make changes just to have it fit within your sentence, the flow of your sentence. Like sometimes you might need to change, if they said I, you might need to change that to he or things like that, or change the tense of a verb or something like that. So if you want to add a word or change a word, you can use brackets like this. So you'd put the word that you added or changed within the bracket. For example, if you changed this to grocery store in here, whoops, actually that's not a quote, sorry. If you changed biblical truths to ideas for some reason, that's what it would look like. You can also use ellipses if you want to leave off some words, like maybe it's a really long sentence and you only want the beginning and the end of it. You can put the dots to show that you left out that phrase or that sentence or a word. Also, if there was an error in the original, you can use SIC to show that that was an error from the original person and not your own. For example, if he misspelled supermarket, you could say sick to show that that wasn't your own error. You're being true to the original. Okay. So like I mentioned, like if you do change the meaning of the text, that's considered plagiarism. Or if you misrepresent what the author says, this can be a danger for students that just skim a work and then pick out a sentence to put in their paper. Skimming can be a very useful technique. You don't have to read everything, every word, everything in the source. I use speed reading a lot myself. However, you do want to make sure you do that carefully because it is possible to pull something out that isn't exactly what the author is saying. For example, they might be developing an idea that they're ultimately arguing against. So then if you pulled out a sentence and said that that was what they're arguing, that would be, the author wouldn't be too happy with that because they were actually arguing the opposite of that. So you really want to make sure you understand what the overall ideas and arguments are before you pull something out and stick it in your paper. Okay. One of the most important things you can be working on to avoid plagiarism is how you take notes. So taking notes really carefully. In a minute, we're going to be seeing some examples of published authors who've been accused of plagiarism. And the biggest factor they all talked about was that they did not take notes well. So that, yeah, and this is where you can accidentally plagiarize. So it's good to come up with whatever system works well for you, but to be consistent about that and be clear about it. First of all, you want to make sure you indicate when you're taking notes what source you got it from. So at the top of my notes, I'll always include, I got it from this author, maybe part of the title at the top. And then I'll put the page numbers next to the exact quotes or ideas that I pull out. That will save you time in the long run because then when you're writing your paper, you don't have to go back and try and figure out what page number it was on, what source it was from. But it can also, more dangerously, can lead to plagiarism if you don't keep track of that. You also want to make it really clear which are your own words and your own ideas and which are the authors, because you don't want to get it wrong either way. You don't want to assume that something is your own ideas later on that was actually the author's, or vice versa. You don't want to say the author said something that was actually your thoughts as you're reading it. And it's a good idea to keep track of your own thoughts as you're reading, because that's when you can get some good ideas that you could develop later in your paper. Again, to have your own ideas represented in the paper. But you do want to make it clear which ones are your ideas and which are the authors. So I usually do that by putting just brackets around my own words. And then the authors are not in brackets. And if I use the exact words, I try and use quotation marks around it. I've heard some people use different colors to represent that. So maybe you'd highlight yours in a different color or use a different color of font. One of the authors we'll look at later keeps them in completely separate files, so they're not even close to getting mixed up. Okay, and we already talked about this idea. All right, let's look at some actual examples of published authors who are caught plagiarizing. So this doesn't just happen with students. It can happen for professors and authors who are later on in their careers. So that's another reason it's a good idea to get in the habit now of being careful about not plagiarizing, being careful about how you take notes, because if you go on later and are an academic, you don't want to be caught in plagiarism then, because it can be pretty devastating for these people's careers. I think were pretty much over or severely affected by this later on. So our first example is Andreas Kostenberger, who's a professor of New Testament, and he plagiarized from our own D.A. Carson in his commentary, which is the Baker Exegetical Commentaries, so a well-known publisher, well-established commentary. So he contained content from Carson's work that he didn't cite. And when he was explaining what happened, he said that it was a problem with note-taking and that he was reducing the length of the content in his paper, in his book, and that he lost some of the citations probably in that process. So it's kind of a sloppiness and not paying careful attention to it. So again, that's why you'd want to be really careful about that, about making sure you're taking good notes. And if you're doing editing, making sure you don't lose citations and things along the way. Peter O'Brien was another professor of New Testament who wrote commentaries published by Zondervan. And after he was accused of plagiarism, Zondervan pulled all of the unsold books and pulped them and offered refunds. And a lot of libraries removed the books so that people wouldn't use them. The Trinity Library still has them, but we have a warning in the front cover saying this was found to be plagiarized and things like that. So again, another big publisher, another big commentary series that was found to have plagiarism. And his explanation also says that his work processes have been faulty. Yeah, that's pretty much all he says. So again, he's saying he didn't do it intentionally, but it was an accidental error through not being careful about his notes and his citations. Okay, and our final example is Doris Kearns Goodwin, who's a professor at Harvard in government and has written a lot of popular biographies. So her problem was she included footnotes to the work she was citing, but not quotation marks around the exact words. So again, the problem of not quoting, even though you have the citation. So she talks about the kind of scope of her work in which she was taking tons of notes, lots of footnotes. She was doing this everything by longhand before computers were really around as much. So then it turned out to be, she said, it turned out to not be foolproof in the end. So she used to take these notes and then go back and recheck each of the books to make sure the quotes were accurate and make sure she was quoting the right things. But somehow she missed some of those books. I forgot to put quotations around them. So she said now she's revised how she does her research. She does on a computer. She keeps her quotes completely separate from her own thoughts and ideas. And when she's writing, she makes sure to add footnotes right away as she's writing. That's another thing that's important to do. Like when you're writing your paper, don't just assume that you'll go back and add the footnotes later. You can have a placeholder, maybe where you put the author and page number in there, and then go back later and do the full citation, so you're not interrupting your flow. But make sure you do have something as a placeholder there. I remember one example of plagiarism I saw where the student said, oh, I had meant to go back and add that quote and that citation, but I forgot. So don't do something that you could forget. If I have a placeholder, I'll oftentimes put it in bold or highlight it in my work so I can go back and make sure I don't miss that either. Okay, and then I have my references to all the things that I cite in here so that I'm academically honest. Let me show you just a few things on the library website that could be helpful. If you go to Get Help and then Citation and Formatting, there are some useful resources on here. First of all, there's the plagiarism tutorial, which talks about a lot of the ideas we're talking about here. And it also has a plagiarism quiz, which I would recommend doing. It tests whether you can recognize whether something is plagiarized or not. And I actually learned a lot from it myself when I did it the first time. It gets into more nuances even than we talked about today. So that's good to do. Under TIU style, this will have helpful links for you on how to cite and use TIU style. If you haven't seen the TIU style before, that's good to look at. It talks about things like how to format your paper, some citation things that are specific to our school. There are also a couple of templates that you can use either for your class papers or a dissertation that includes all the formatting laid out for you. So that's helpful. Okay. And the TIU style, it's used by most of the programs at TEDS and TGS. By the way, if you're not sure what style your program uses, you can go to this overview and look down here, and this will tell you. So a lot of the undergrad areas use APA, MLA, some use Chicago. The TEDS mostly uses TIU style with the footnote style. A couple of the PhD programs use the parenthetical style, and The New Testament and Old Testament programs also use SBL as an additional, the Society of Biblical Literature style. So then you can find out more about each of those styles over here. So again, to go back to TIU style is based on Turabian, and Turabian is based on Chicago. So Chicago is kind of the foundational style that was developed for publishers. And we have a link to the full book here online, so you can access it there. So if you have any hard citation questions, you can go there and search for it. It's a very big book, the print version of it. And then Turabian is built on the Chicago Manual style, written particularly for students. So more about how to do citation for student papers rather than Chicago's for people publishing. We have the full book is available in the library. So if you want to look at that, there is a quick guide online that has some quick references on how to just cite a book or a website or an article, things like that. The most common things you would need to use. Okay, and then TIU style is based on Turabian and includes some formatting things that Turabian doesn't cover. And I mentioned SBL style, which is built on Chicago and Turabian and has information particularly for citing in the biblical areas. So this has, on this page, we have some of the abbreviations. There's a student supplement that gives you, again, some of the basics of SBL, and we have the full book in the library. We have some page of commonly asked TIU style questions. So for example, if you're using an ebook that doesn't have page numbers, how you cite that. Basically, you can cite a chapter or a section heading in there. If you don't have a date, if there's no author, here's a little bit more about how to cite a Bible passage, including the version abbreviation and abbreviations for the books of the Bible. And technically, you're supposed to cite any time you get an idea from someone else, even if it's someone you talk to. So for example, in my master's thesis, I had a book discussion at my church, and someone raised a really good idea that I ended up using in my paper, and I cited that book discussion group as a citation in there. So let's give some examples of how to do that. Here's also how to cite if your text cites another author. Basically, especially as a higher level graduate student, you should be trying to track down the original source and cite that instead. But if you have trouble getting a hold of that source, there is an example of how you can cite a secondary citation. Okay, I also wanted to point out Zotero, which is a program, a free program you can download, and this will create citations for you. And we have this whole guide on here about how to use it, how to install it and use it. And we also have workshops and videos on how to do that as well. So you can check that out. And then finally, I wanted to direct you to the Ask a Librarian link at the top here. If you do have a question about citation, there's a lot of gray area in citation and plagiarism. You can contact us. You can either contact the reference desk over here to generally ask a question, or you can contact me particularly over here. I've answered a lot of questions related to this, so you can email me. Yeah, and you can also ask your professor because, again, in the gray areas, they'll oftentimes be the ones deciding if it's plagiarism or not, so you can ask them about their opinion on it. But I can also look things up for you on TIU style and things like that. So I hope this has been helpful. Let us know if you have any questions and if we can help you in any other ways.